Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. And I am indeed here very often doing research at the library that is behind us here, which is a great collection, including many things on Lafayette. So today I will talk about Lafayette, as we can see, Vive Lafayette. And of course, it is in the context of an exhibition that is here just behind us as well, Fete Lafayette. It's a great exhibition, so if you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely come and see it. It has swords from Lafayette, original letters, documentation, a lot of interesting things. And it's, of course, mainly as well relating to the farewell tour of the Marquis de Lafayette that is celebrated right now. 2024 is the 200th anniversary of his farewell tour, which means that he came back in 1824 to celebrate his own role, of course, in the American Revolution and to commemorate the 50th anniversary at that time of the revolution. And so that is now celebrated. It has just been kicked off by the American Friends of Lafayette in New York. You can see there underneath, but they're going to do many, many, many events for the next coming year, I think a year and a half even, just celebrating Lafayette and his role, and especially also everything that the American Revolution stands for, of course. So Lafayette is well known to us all, of course. We know many statues celebrate, commemorate Lafayette, the Marquis. A lot of places are named after him, as you can see on this map, but there's many schools, many cities, many counties, many different places in America, especially, well, North America, US, that are named after the Marquis de Lafayette. Here he is really celebrated, of course, as one of the main heroes of the American Revolution, which is interesting for me because I've been studying mainly in France, and in France, he's not that celebrated as he is here. So it's wonderful to see the excitement that exists around the figure of Lafayette. But I will also discuss a little bit how he became the symbol of the French in the American Revolution, while of course about 6,000 other soldiers, a lot of other officers, and even many, many sailors as well were also French. So why did he become that symbol? That will be one of our questions today. But I will also mainly discuss who he was, what he did for the American Revolution, and on top of that, what happened to him when he came back from that American Revolution. I'm not going to do a full biography, but I will focus on a few of the highlights of his life. So I want to start with the key to the Bastille, which will come back a few times throughout this presentation, which is hanging right now at Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon, in the actual mansion. This key was sent by Lafayette during the French Revolution to his friend, his almost adoptive father, George Washington, who of course had been his general during the revolution. So a few years after his return from the American Revolution, this key was sent by Lafayette to Washington. And he said, "Give me leave, my dear general, to present you with a picture of the Bastille," which was framed, you can see it here, that picture underneath, of the Bastille, just that it looked a few days after I had ordered its demolition, with the main key of that fortress of despotism. So this key, of course, was a symbol to Lafayette to say, we have our revolution in France, but it was also commemoration of what they had done together for the American cause against despotism. So that's the key, and we'll see it come back a few times. But what I want to say is that it's, of course, Lafayette represents both the American, but also the French Revolution and its aftermath. So we will discuss that throughout this presentation. I will mainly focus on the American Revolution and the French, and then sort of jump through the end of his life fast, because there's so much to say. I think you would need about 15 other lectures to talk about everything. But of course, we need to start with where he was born. He was born here in Chavagnac, which is a castle in France, of course, 6th of September, 1757. You can see here where it is compared to, for instance, Paris, but it's in the region called the Auvergne. And so he was born there in this castle in quite a wealthy family of the time, called the Lafayette family, quite obviously. So you can see his mother and his father is obviously called the Marquis de Lafayette himself. So growing up, he had a few, where he was living in that castle for a few years, but here you can see his bedroom, okay? But one of the most impactful events of his life was that his father died when he was still very young. He was actually only 2 years old, a little baby, and his father was in the 7 Years' War, also known here as the French-Indian War, of course, in the European front called the 7 Years' War. His father was in one of the French regiments at this Battle of Minden, and he was famously killed there. So this will have an impact, obviously, on Lafayette's life. First of all, he will hate the British after this because they kill his father. But it's mainly also a big impact because he's going to inherit the title of Marquis as well as the wealth of his father. And after this, a few other of his family members will also die, which leads him to inherit a great fortune. He is from a noble family, he's an aristocrat, he's part of the military tradition of the French Ancien Régime, but he's also very wealthy. And so he will go with his mother to Paris to live here at the Jardin de Luxembourg and the Palais de Luxembourg. If you've ever been in Paris, it's the same today. It's in this huge park in the 6th arrondissement. I used to live around the corner, so I'm always excited to see this again. But he grew up here and went to some military schools and to some other schools. And so his education was mainly military, but also the sort of classic training for a Frenchman at the time, a French aristocrat, I should absolutely say. This is also where he went, the military academy of France at the time. And so he was trained as, of course, an officer. However, for him, it became complicated because there were a lot of reforms in France at this time. After the 7 Years' War that the French lost, they were reforming their army. And so it led to a few regiments to be reformed, and there were not that many options for young officers at this time to start their careers. But luckily, he made a good choice. He found a good wife to get married to, called Marie-Françoise de Noailles. And then, of course, they got married in 1774. I'm skipping through this a little because, of course, my main point will be the American Revolution. But of course, this particular wedding is very important to him because he is going to be part of one of the most influential families of France at this time, the Noailles family. 1774 has to be reminded, Lafayette's only 16, his wife is only 14. Adrienne de Noailles actually was 12 when the arrangements were made between their parents, but her mother, here you can see them, very young, her mother said, no, we have to wait just a little longer. It's not okay, she's way too young. So they waited a little bit, but they, of course, the marriage was arranged. Here's the Duc d'Ayen, his father-in-law, who was a very influential man at court and very high in the French army. And here is her mother, of course, her name is d'Aguesseau, but the Duchesse. And so now Lafayette was already wealthy, but now he has all the connections he had hoped for at court to start his military career. He is living in this gorgeous mansion in Paris, of course, called the Hôtel de Noailles. It's today a hotel, so if ever you want to stay there, you can. But so you can see it's almost next to the Louvre, to the Tuileries in Paris. So he grew up here, grew up as in he became older. He was 16, he turned 18, everything. He was part of the army that he had hoped for, but he was also part of the glitter and glamour, you could say, of Paris. However, he was not one of these courtiers that was very good at all the rules of the Palace of Versailles, of the particular ways of dancing, all the social codes. He was considered a little clumsy at the time. He was especially not considered a good dancer, which sounds sort of funny, but it was important at the time to be able to really shine at court. But of course, his main ambition was really the army, the French army, and to have the French glory of the French aristocrats to be part of the army. And so he started in the regiment of his father-in-law, the Noailles, and rose to the rank of captain, and then also became a part of the Maison Militaire du Roi, which is sort of a bodyguard of the king. However, this became complicated because, as I said, there were reforms on its way, and the entire regiment got dissolved. And so his position was just, it left, let's say, it's gone. He couldn't do what he had hoped to do. And this is important for understanding what he's going to do later. So in the meantime, Louis XV, the king, of course, he passed away. And so the successor was Louis XVI in 1775. This is quite a crucial year for, obviously, the American Revolution, but also for the advent of Louis XVI, his reign, and mainly for Lafayette's first encounter with the American Revolution. He is at a dinner in Metz, which is a place where he was for military reasons. And so in 1775, he meets the Duke of Gloucester, who is the brother of George III. And so during this dinner, he hears Lafayette is present and hears of the American Revolution. Of course, the brother of George III is talking about this, like about the cause and the reasons for the revolution to have occurred. But Lafayette just has one big hope right now. He wants to join this cause. He feels absolutely appealed to the cause of liberty and of freedoms, as he would write, but he hears especially a reason for him to go because, as we know, he wanted a military career. He wanted the military glory that he just couldn't find in France because of all these reforms that had left him fall apart or outside of the military possibilities. So you could say it's quite pragmatic. He just wanted to find a new job, but he was also quite inspired at the same time, or at least that's what he writes, who knows. So of course, this is a time of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord. And it's also important to know that Lafayette at the time was becoming a Freemason. So in 1775, he joined a Parisian lodge. And from then on, he's part of this wide international network that, of course, is very influential for the American Revolution. So Lafayette has been inspired by this meeting, this dinner. He is inspired by the ideas that he has read about. He's going to look in, or like read a lot of news articles. He's going to read about the revolution, and he really wants to go. He's part of course, as I said, the Freemasons that are also a circle that is very excited about the revolution. He's also becoming part of the circles of the French Enlightenment quite fast. The French Enlightenment, of course, is a movement that wants progress for humanity, and them seeing the realization of one of their most important ideas on more equality, more liberties, for them is very inspiring. So the French thinkers such as Voltaire and Diderot and d'Alembert are getting excited about the American Revolution, and especially in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence comes out or is published and so translated in French. The ideas of course, more equalities, more liberties, more representation of the people resonate in the minds of all these French enlightened figures, and Lafayette is one of them. He's still very young, but he's getting more and more excited together with a lot of others. It's sometimes portrayed as if Lafayette's sort of on his own getting very excited about the revolution, but he is just part of a large group of French pro-Américanistes, is how they would call it, pro-American thinkers. So here you can see the French philosophers of the time. So they're inspired by ideas. The French are mainly also inspired, of course, by their revenge. The 7 Years' War is a moment where they lost most of their territories and about everything in North America. And for them to see a revolution and rebellion starting in North America, so the British colonies, is an inspiration to think if we help them, it might weaken the British. So the French are inspired for ideas, but most importantly, for their idea of weakening the British and getting themselves back on the world stage, because of course they lost so bad that they just need their prestige restored. So the French here have two main motivations. Lafayette himself has another motivation, which is also to avenge his father's death. He had never known him, but of course he remembers very well that the British, and in particularly people such as Phillips and Cornwallis, have actually killed his father. So there is a lot of different things going on, of course, both in France and America. But here you can see the American Revolution's first years are not going well. We all know this, the army is not well funded, they're not well trained, they don't have proper arms, they don't have proper uniforms, and they're looking for allies. And of course, you know this, but the allies are particularly to be found in France, because we know how excited they are about this new opportunity. So the first stage of the French help, because there's going to be a lot of French aid, but before Louis XVI and his ministers do not want to help by sending immediately an army. They want to give money, they want to give arms. So the French have it's even a secret mission, they call it the covert aid to America, but it's mainly orchestrated by the man who you can see, the Comte de Vergennes, the Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time. So there's a lot of different sendings with different ships, many secret weapons arrive, secret uniforms, all these things. And it helps the cause of the American Revolution a great deal because the Americans didn't have all these things. So this is the first stage, but then the American revolutionaries see that they need much more. they need more help. They need especially the expertise of the French. And this is where Lafayette will come in again, because of course, as we know, he's a well-trained military man, but he doesn't have a function at the time. And so here you can see Benjamin Franklin was seducing the Parisian public opinion, of course, to help more and to give more aid. Here you can see him. Maybe you've seen the show called Franklin, which is all about this, but it's really exciting to see that, or exciting to see for me at least, that series, to see that come alive. But what's interesting is that Franklin, of course, is really influential in even in encouraging the French even more to really start helping. And so when he goes to Versailles and meets Louis XVI, Louis XVI does decide to send more aid. He had seen that some of his aid, the arms, but also the uniforms and so on, did help. But he also saw, if we really want to crush the British with winning through the American Revolution, we will need help to help them more. So this is the context where Lafayette is part of, and he's inspired by all these ideas, by the fact there is already help sent to America. And I'm telling all this for you to understand, he's not on his own. He is in a large group. There is already a lot of help going from France to America, even if it's a little secret, but he's part of that group. There's another envoy, less well known than Franklin, but it's Silas Deane. And Silas Deane is the one that's going to really recruit Lafayette to go to America. So here's their first meeting. He's also standing with Johann de Kalb, who is also another Frenchman, of course, with who is going to come with Lafayette. Here you can see Silas Deane. But so there's a whole episode where Lafayette wants to go. He's kind of enlisted. He wants to leave, and Silas Deane has given him the official approval. But then he needs a ship, so he's going to buy an actual vessel for himself and the other Frenchmen that are going to go. It's said often that he paid it himself, but if you go dig a little deeper into this whole story, it's not completely true that he paid for himself and disobeyed the French king, as they all say, because the French king knew he was going, but he couldn't authorize it officially because they were not at war with the British. So having one of your most important courtiers going to France is complicated. So the French king kind of said to him, do not go, but he knew. So there's a myth there around this whole story that has to be reconsidered probably, but he did purchase this ship and he left to America. So Lafayette, you can see here, he's 19 years old. We have to always think how young he was and how scary it must have been for him too, because the travel to come here was about 2 months. He arrives on the shores, and of course he has to find his way all the way to Philadelphia to present himself with the letters of introduction that he had from Franklin, but also from Silas Deane, and to say, here I am, I'm a major general, because that was the appointment he had at the time. And so in the meantime, just saying, like, I want to make sure we all know too, but he had his first daughter his wife was pregnant, but he left before. So he didn't meet that first daughter, Anastasie, but he did have already one child at the time. So he arrives in 1777, full of hope, full of his ideas. And I'm sure you all know this, but when he arrives, it's very disappointing to him because he's not at all the first Frenchman, and the American Congress and also George Washington are a little overwhelmed by the amount of Frenchmen that comes to America to offer their aid. They want money, they want prestigious ranks immediately, they want these positions. They're a little arrogant often because they consider themselves the real military specialists, while of course there's a lot of American officers in place already. So the French are not that popular. Another important reason is the French are not popular because they were the enemy in the 7 Years' War. That the whole thing I said about the 7 Years' War is the British were fighting against the French, but of course the British were also the American people fighting in the British army. So they had fought against the French, and they're like, oh, why are you here right now? We can't work together. There's a religious problem too. There were Catholics, there were Protestant against each other, and a lot of other problems between these two groups of people. So when Lafayette arrived, he was quite disappointed to find no enthusiasm, and he was the first day was actually sent away by Congress. But then through a few other people, and especially his letters of recommendation from Franklin himself, helped him to then come back and be actually appointed Major General of the army. He was together with a lot of others, as I said, that are less famous as he was, but had also played their important roles in the American Revolution. One, for instance, is Duportail, who was, of course, an engineer that played a very important role for the Continental Army's evolution and creation. And so the first moment he meets Washington is, of course, one of the most famous moments happening in Philadelphia at the City Tavern. And it's a moment of where Washington is still a little hesitant, but Lafayette is obviously very excited to meet George Washington, the famous general, who is very well known at the time already in France, as being one of the main leaders of this cause that people care for. And so at the beginning, Washington is a little reluctant, but he does see one very important thing, which is Lafayette has money, but Lafayette especially has the connections that Washington very much needs to get more aid, possibly through the French king. So the relationship starts well. Lafayette is going to be sent to his first battle, the Battle of Brandywine, where he gets wounded in his leg. But this is really a heroic moment for him. This is, by the way, his first battle. He had only been trained in France. He had never seen war. So this is the first battle he was, of course, involved in, where he plays an important part in the retreat of the American army. But of course, it's not a victory for the Americans, but it is a victory sort of for Lafayette because he becomes more famous at this point. One of his main motivations was really to find military glory, to have glory in a sense, the French aristocratic way of the 18th century, which means more something like honor. But in order to have honor, bleeding on a battlefield is a very good first thing to do. So this was a good start for Lafayette and his career as a military man here in the Continental Army. I'm not going to discuss all these battles, but he did a few. So he went to the Battle of Gloucester. He was, of course, part of the very tough Valley Forge winter, a moment where he and Washington became very close because they had more time together. He also went to the Battle of Barren Hill in 1778. And all these battles were not very successful, nor were they very big. They were mainly indecisive battles in which he played a role, but it was never that decisive. But he would write to France that he played a very heroic role. And to his wife in particular, he would really promote himself as a hero of the American Revolution. And I would argue that one of the main reasons he becomes so much more famous than all the others is his writing to his wife and to some influential people in France and in America about his role and how important it was that they would fight, but also how heroic his own deeds were. And it worked very well for him, as we can see still today. Battle of Monmouth he's part of, in which at the same time, the French-American alliance will be solidified. 1778, in February, Vergennes and Franklin sign the official alliance. So instead of being just a secret aid, as before, as I said, they send weapons, they send money, they're going to send an actual army. So that is a huge shift for the American Revolution, because from just being a rebellion against the motherland, it becomes a full war with an ally, the French. And there's also the Spanish, there's the Dutch. So it's becoming a much larger war, of course. And Lafayette is very well aware of this. And he is most excited about this moment because finally France is officially in the war and he represents that. He really is the person that represents the alliance and the French-American relations of the time. And so unfortunately, the first two campaigns go wrong. When the first expedition arrives, it's under D'Estaing, who is here, you can see the admiral. The first campaign in which Lafayette is quite heavily involved in Newport, Rhode Island, fails. And then another one later on, the Siege of Savannah, is also a big defeat for both the French and their American allies. So Lafayette right now is very disappointed. He was hoping for victory because finally the French army came and here they are, they lost twice. Very bad for his own reputation because he had sold to the Americans like, yes, if we bring the French in, we're going to win. And twice it was a complete deception. And so he decides to go back to France in 1779. He goes to Versailles. He goes to a lot of influential figures to try for aid, different aid this time, because of course D'Estaing did not work out. One of the main reasons D'Estaing and the Continental Army didn't work well together was a lack of understanding between the allies. They had a lot of differences, as I said before, and they didn't overcome these differences. They were just fighting together, but they didn't take time enough to come together and to form a closer bond to fight. Lafayette had seen that firsthand and realized that it was very important to not do the same thing and to bring another team in that would understand cultural subtleties, cultural differences, and that would want to really overcome these big issues that the French and Americans were facing. A little example is that when D'Estaing is in Newport, he needed to attack at a certain moment, and then the Americans were there before he had arrived and were like, we are gonna attack first. Then he said, no, that's not possible because I'm an aristocrat and I'm higher than you in rank, so I have to go first, which led to 2 days of days and a complete disaster. But just as an example, the French aristocrats had these rules that they had to follow, and Lafayette was like, they need to let go of these things. They just need to adapt to the actual situation there. So Lafayette was very much aware of this, but he was also taking this opportunity to, of course, get different help, but especially to make himself shine in Paris. He would, of course, be the hero of the American Revolution. He would come back and he would stand together with Marie Antoinette, the Queen, with Louis XVI, the King, and he was acclaimed by everybody. He would come to all these different locations, and everyone was absolutely excited that the hero of the American Revolution came back to France. He also saw this as hopefully an opportunity to join the French army, because now that he had a sort of fame, he hoped that the French king would indeed place him in an expedition. And he actually did, because in 1779, there was a plan to invade England, and Lafayette was part of that plan. He was in the command of this expedition, but it didn't really work out. Actually, it failed. The Spanish and French had to go together. It all led to a lot of problems, but the point is Lafayette again saw the limits of the French aid to the American Revolution, because again, something is failing here. So the urgency of success becomes very important, because what the French mainly hoped was restore their prestige. It's not working at all. In the meantime, another child is born, George Washington Lafayette. Obviously, the name is from his general, and he will come to America during the French Revolution. And you see a photo of him older, which is one of these first photos taken. It's always fun. But so Lafayette advises to get another type of team together to finally be able to work better with the Americans. He is himself hoping to be named general, because of course, that's one of his main ambitions. However, the French king decides, together with his ministers, that he's a little too young to become the general of the French officers that would be sent. Instead, he selects Rochambeau, who is known to be one of the more successful French generals of his time. He's done a lot of wars before this one, but especially he's known as someone that's quite sociably good, as in he's good to what I said, to overcome problems, to understand them, and he would never want to be himself on the forefront. He is a military man that knows his position when he needs to do that. That's why he's selected. And so Lafayette returns at this point to America to announce the arrival of Rochambeau, together with 6,000 soldiers, 6,000 sailors, and of course, a lot of material too. So weapons, money, everything is brought for this new expedition. So there's a lot of hope for Lafayette, because finally there's a new group, a new people, and hopefully these people can work together. So he comes back to Philadelphia to go to the French ambassador to announce the news, who you can see here. And then he also goes, of course, to George Washington himself to announce the big news. In the meantime, the French fleet is coming, they're sailing towards America. And one of the people that is on that boat is the person I've studied a lot, called François-Jean de Chastellux. And I will focus a little bit on him too now, because he is one of these people that will really make the alliance work in a social way, in a more cultural way. Second time in the meantime. Okay. And so General Rochambeau is, of course, the general, and then his major general is Chastellux, who is sort of his right hand at the time, but he will mainly become the liaison officer of the time. And what's especially interesting is that he is Lafayette's uncle. So people have not necessarily studied him much. I have for 10 years. I can tell you why later. But the point is, Chastellux was Lafayette's uncle and was also his mentor already before before Lafayette left to America. He had been working a lot with Chastellux on discussing military matters, but also the enlightened thought and the American Revolution. So I wrote a book about him, which you can see here, François-Jean de Chastellux, his biography. And I just will take 1 minute to say, because I found his private papers in this castle in Burgundy, which is a collection of about 6,000 pages that you can see how it looks there. But you can also see the letters of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, of Franklin, of most of these big names of the American Revolution wrote to him. As he was a major general, he was one of the key figures of the French-American alliance. And then there's also a lot of letters of Lafayette. And so for what I'm going to tell after this, Lafayette and Chastellux relation is very important and comes from these private papers that no one had ever looked at because it was in a private collection that the family kept secret for all these years. So Chastellux is a general, he becomes major general, but he was also a philosopher of the Enlightenment, known for one book in particular called De la Félicité Publique, which is on public happiness. And so Lafayette and him were close because, again, it's his uncle through marriage. And I don't want to explain because it's a long story how that exactly is connected. But he is the uncle of Adrienne de Noailles, who is, of course, Lafayette's wife. So from their marriage onwards, they become very close. And Chastellux is advising him on many different matters. And so to go back to the American campaign, Lafayette, of course, is already in America because he had just announced to Washington the arrival of Rochambeau, as well as the arrival of his uncle, Lafayette, aka Chastellux, sorry. And so here you can see this group, Washington, the French ambassador, and Lafayette are preparing for the arrival of Rochambeau, Chastellux, and the 6,000 men they're bringing to America. So they end up in Newport, Rhode Island when they arrive. And Lafayette had been involved in preparing hospitals, preparing provisions, all these different things for the arrival. And so here you can see how Newport, Rhode Island looked at the time. But what is interesting is that when they arrive, of course, they have to deal with a lot of things. They have to install their encampment, they have to buy provisions, they have to make hospitals, they have to really get ready for the war. But one of the main problems that Lafayette is coming as soon as they arrive, like 2 weeks after, Lafayette comes to the camp to welcome them in behalf of Washington. But at the same time, he's also telling them that the Continental Army is much weaker than the French had thought. And he also says to Rochambeau, your army is way too weak too. We can't do much, but maybe we should go to New York and just try to attack immediately. And so he has this bold plan to say, we need to attack New York, even if it's dangerous, let's just do it. But then Rochambeau immediately says, no, we cannot do that. That's way too dangerous for us because we have too many sick. We have another fleet coming. We're waiting for other reinforcements. And so it's a problem at this time. And Lafayette and Rochambeau become very hostile towards another because Rochambeau thinks, you're a little 20-year-old man. What do you want? You cannot command me because I am Rochambeau, the main general. So that's a serious dispute starts. And Chastellux is luckily there to calm them down a little bit. But it's also interesting because now Rochambeau asks Chastellux to become the liaison officer instead of Lafayette, the young and ambitious as Rochambeau sees him. So from now on, Washington and Rochambeau will be in, how do you call it, like in relationship because of Chastellux. So the interpreter he will become, because of course Rochambeau doesn't speak French, doesn't speak English, and Washington doesn't speak French, but Chastellux does speak both languages. Okay, so fast forward to in Hartford conference, which is in September. So they arrive in July, they do September, they meet. Washington meets Rochambeau to discuss what can we do. And they both conclude that they cannot do anything, actually, without having more aid from France coming, without having more aid from the Congress coming, and especially having more troops and more money available for their next campaign. And as we remember, all these problems that were there between the French and Americans are still there. There's a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of prejudices circulating. Everyone is quite suspicious one to another. And so Chastellux now proposes to find solutions for that. Instead of just waiting for reinforcement, he sees value, just like Lafayette had, to see how can we bridge all our differences and how can we fight together in a more organized way, but also how can we understand each other? How do we understand each other's cultures, religions, languages, all these different aspects that make alliances work? And so Chastellux proposes to do this in different ways, one including a big tour of America, so the different states, to understand not just the military options, but especially to understand the way of finding each other, to understanding each other. And he's going to do this with several people, including Lafayette, of course, his cousin. So they're going to travel for weeks together. Lafayette is going to show him different battlefield sites. Other officers of the Continental Army are going to show Chastellux and the people he's traveling with a lot of other sites. But what's important here to understand is that the Americans are showing the French their theater of war, but especially it's going to work together. They're doing dinners, they're doing balls, gala, like events together. They're going to understand each other. They're becoming friends at the time. And one of the most important meetings there is with George Washington himself, when Lafayette introduces Chastellux to his uncle here in the Day Mansion, which is in New Jersey. I think, no, it's in New York, sorry. Anyway, close to what's called the Tatoa Falls. And here you can see the description, which is a page of the manuscript version of the diary that Chastellux wrote about this moment, in which he explains how he met Washington and how he got actually convinced that they could win the war together, because it was so important to them to understand each other more. And as I said, for a lot of the officers, it didn't work well together, but Chastellux and Washington became instant friends. They had, what Chastellux says, a few glasses of Madeira that accelerated their acquaintances. But they became very close because, of course, their military mission and also all the other interests that bound these two men. And so I just want to skip, because what I want to say here is mainly that Chastellux and Lafayette do a tour together, in which, of course, Lafayette shows him, for instance, Brandywine battlefield where he got wounded. So he explains to him, this was a tree where I got wounded and there's still blood on it, apparently. Well, don't know if that's true, but that's the detail. But it's interesting to see that the French are gathering intelligence to see what can we do. And Lafayette is really part of that mission, but also to make these allies come closer together. And so Chastellux and Lafayette play this understudied role. This is not known because all the papers relating to this were in that castle. So it shows a different side from Lafayette on top of all the other things he has done. He was really one of these connectors together with his uncle and a few other French officers in this particular alliance. And one of the main outcomes, of course, is that they decided to go to Yorktown together based on this information. That's a whole other story that I do not want to get into today, but it is an interesting aspect, again, of that cooperation and the way the French and Americans try to understand each other and try to figure out their options. And so after this moment that they travel together and spend a lot of time together, Lafayette will be sent to the southern front of the war by Washington, of course. And so he's going to play the role we all know, chasing Cornwallis. Chastellux continues his research that he has done before too, while Lafayette is at the moment in the South. He writes to his uncle a letter that is unpublished, that is really telling, because he is afraid. He really does not like where he's at. He is in command, he's Major General, and he explains to his uncle that he is not up for the task. He just doesn't know what to do. He's afraid. He says, my pride makes me tremble at the thought of losing a battle. He's convinced he's going to lose from Cornwallis, Lord Cornwallis, of course. And he says, he causes me devilish fear. He also mentions that a previous general was not that scary to him because he was always drunk. But now Cornwallis had come and he was really afraid. And he admits this to his uncle, which is rare. As we remember, Lafayette was more someone that would heroify himself. So this is a moment where Chastellux and Rochambeau and all these Frenchmen are already thinking that they should go to the south to attack the British. But these type of letters coming in make them realize, if we don't, Lafayette is going to lose, meaning our entire southern front will be lost. So here they go. They come to Yorktown. And so the French will move to Yorktown at this point. While, of course, Lafayette will have to maintain the Continental Army, the British Army there. And he plays one of his most crucial roles of the American Revolution at this time, because Lafayette, his task is to keep Cornwallis there. If ever he would escape, the French and the American troops that are marching towards Yorktown will, well, find no one to fight with, obviously. So it was very crucial that Lafayette kept them where they were in Yorktown. And I would say that's one of his most important roles of his life, because without that, the Yorktown campaign could have absolutely failed, of course. It was obviously a cooperation of many other people to make this this entire operation a success. The French Navy is absolutely crucial too, because of course they block the Chesapeake Bay, and then the Continental and the French armies that are both fighting with Lafayette, of course, as one of the leaders of this particular battles that are happening through the siege of Yorktown. I would be happy to explain a lot about what Lafayette really did, but I want to skip over through what he would do when he come back. But of course, Lafayette was quite clever here at Yorktown, because he, of course, considered himself one of the heroes already, but he made the very good choice to go to Versailles himself to announce the victory to Louis XVI. So he goes to Versailles, and of course, he is the first to arrive. Rochambeau and Chastellux and all these other people are still in America at the time and will only come a year and a half after him, meaning he is the one that gets all the accolades for this victory. So it's a very well timed, and he becomes the hero of Yorktown in France. Very well planned by himself. He calls the daughter he'll have at this, because every time he comes back, there's a child. Okay, here's another, Virginie, named after Virginia, where Yorktown was won, of course. So he has one child called George Washington, and the other is now Virginia. So this, of course, has a big impact. So he's in Paris in 1783 when the Treaty of Paris is signed. So the War of Independence is at its end. American independence is officially recognized by both France, by Britain, Great Britain, and of course, the birth of the United States is official. Lafayette at the moment is in France, but he will go fast to America again. In the meantime, of course, the Society of Cincinnati, since we're here, I had to mention, but 1783 is the creation of the Society of the Cincinnati. And Lafayette, of course, while in France, receives letters to announce that he is one of the main members. He will help to find the other members, to identify them, to get them into the society, to get them excited about the society that is really put in place to remember the role of the French and Americans in the American Revolution. There's a famous eagle, of course, designed by L'Enfant, that is designed by L'Enfant and distributed as well in Paris. And so he's really a node in this network of the Society of the Cincinnati, both in France and as in America. Up here in this building, there's this huge fresco, or however you call this, where Lafayette is receiving his Society of Cincinnati letter from George Washington himself. A made-up scene, because this didn't happen, but it is one of these highlights if you go right up there from this beautiful Anderson house. So while he's still in France, Lafayette gets interested in the cause of abolition of slavery. One of the main things that he had seen of course, in the American Revolution that struck him was the absence of thinking of the abolition of slavery. People are fighting for equalities, for liberties, but they still have enslaved in their entire society, ingrained in the economy. And he started a fight against this in France, as well as in other means, by buying even a plantation and doing sort of tests for gradual abolition with actual people. So he was really into this movement in France, became quite known for it. But of course, he wants, again, the moment where it's some glory time for him. So he goes back in 1784. He goes over a 5-month tour through the different colonies to celebrate independence, as well as his own role there. One of the highlights is, of course, visiting Mount Vernon. And when he comes back for about 4 years, he's very much involved in French-American relations. He is promoting the cause of the American Revolution. He's putting on a lot of trade deals between the different countries. It's really a blossoming of the relations that he has helped establish. But in the meantime, it's really tough because these relations are going down. The French Revolution is about to start, so there's a lot of tensions overall in France. But one of the main problems is that the Americans are turning back to the British for their commerce, for their trade. And France is absolutely not happy with that, because they had hoped to have very advantageous trade out of their help. So Lafayette is in the middle of this, trying to appease the situation and getting new trade deals in, while actually the relations are crumbling at this time. He is, however, involved in, this is also from the Chastellux archive, from that castle that I showed. There's a letter saying that Lafayette and Chastellux are working on a book. They're working on a book portraying the French in the American Revolution in what they say an accurate way. So what they're doing is they're gathering a lot of information, both from France and America, and Lafayette especially has taken steps to achieve your objective to write the history of the war. And Washington will take it upon himself to obtain for me a copy of orders since the beginning of the war, and then his correspondence too. And it's true that in Chastellux' archive, there is a big sort of pile of things that are written by Lafayette, by Washington, by everyone actually that it was part of this, that reflects their work, first of all, to gather the source material, but then what Chastellux would have written this history because they consider it important to remember the French role in the American Revolution, because they already see the relationships faltering at this time. But the problem is that this project will never be done because Chastellux dies before he finishes it. But it's still interesting to see that together, since they have created the hope and the alliance and the working of the alliance together, they want to continue to celebrate the French-American relations and really make an accurate version of the French help in the American Revolution, because they see that some other people are starting to say that the French didn't play that big of a role because there's a nation building in process, and it's not that great to admit that a French king, a monarch, helped establish the Republic. So they want to fight that image, and they also do that a lot with Thomas Jefferson himself, because Thomas Jefferson, of course, is the ambassador to France in the United States. And so Jefferson, together with Lafayette and Chastellux, are doing a few projects. So I said they're writing this book, they're working on a book. Jefferson and Chastellux are working on other publications together to improve the French-American relations, but they also asked Trumbull, the painter, to paint the moment where the French and American, of course, played the most important role, which was the surrender of Cornwallis. We all know this painting, but this was actually commissioned by both, or it was a larger plan. There's a lot to explain there, but one of the people that highly influenced the painting were Thomas Jefferson and Chastellux, because they wanted to show this French role and how important it was. So this painting, obviously, we all know now, but it was painted partially in Paris because the miniatures to make the painting was orchestrated in Paris, in Jefferson's home, together with Lafayette and Chastellux. So all this to say, the French-American relations were not going that well, but Lafayette, Jefferson, Chastellux, these people are really trying to save them. Chastellux writes a book, another book, in which he wants to reform France based on an American system. And he's one of the people of that group, of which Lafayette himself is part as well, where they work together on reforming France in order to prevent a revolution to start in their own country. So Chastellux passes away in 1788 of pneumonia, just very briefly, and he dies, leaving Lafayette now on his own with all these projects. But it leads Jefferson, Lafayette, but also other people to write the Declaration of Rights of Men, of course, heavily inspired by the American Revolution's ideals. So Lafayette continues his role, first of all, as a French revolutionary, full of hope, because, of course, he is the representative of this important document that really puts the basis of the French Revolution too, for the equalities in France. He becomes the head of the National Guard, which is a revolutionary guard, long story, but he's very much involved in the destruction of the Bastille, that we, of course, have all heard of, start of the French Revolution. And he is now a revolutionary. He wants to reform France. He wants a constitutional monarchy. So he doesn't want to abolish the monarchy. He doesn't want to create a republic, but he wants to create sort of a mixed form of that in order to make France work in a different, more fair way, let's say. So when the revolution breaks out, he is one of its main leaders, one of its main important characters. And this is, of course, the moment when he sends that famous key to Washington to say, we have fought together, we have created this successful revolution, and here is the symbol that we are going to do the same. He is full of hope at this time, but unfortunately for him, it becomes much more intense and, of course, much more violent than he had anticipated. And wanting just a constitutional monarchy is not what the more radical French revolutionaries want. They want a total overthrow of the monarchy. And that is too much for Lafayette. He does not agree. And he's also associated with when the king tries to escape, which is a famous Nuit de Varennes, Lafayette is the one that brings them back, but that is not, he's not in favor of immediately getting rid of them. So Lafayette now is considered the traitor of the nation and will be imprisoned for 7 years in total in very tough conditions. His wife is also arrested and decides to join him in this particular cell, his daughters as well. And so he is part of he is in prison for a long time because he was not revolutionary enough for France. And this is one of the reasons that the French do not like Lafayette that much compared to how they like him here so much, because he's not considered a real revolutionary. Maybe he was actually right if you think about all the things that happened, but that's a whole other question. But when he returned from that imprisonment, he lived here at the Château de la Grange, which was a castle of his wife. And they lived there for a few years together until Adrienne passed away, mainly because of a disease she contracted in prison in one of these awful cells for many years. And from that moment onwards, Lafayette's life became quite dark. They lost their money, he lost his wife. Napoleon did not want to have to do anything with him, nor did the king after Louis XVIII. And so he just kind of, got away from the scene of the world at this time. He became much different than we have seen him before as well, physically, and he was quite sick, and it was kind of the end of his life in a way. But 1824 comes in, which of course was the 50th or the beginnings of the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. And this is when James Monroe invites him to come back to America to celebrate the American Revolution, as he is one of the sole survivors of the general staff of George Washington. So he comes back, and this is what I said at the total beginning, there's this farewell tour. So he's gonna do this, and this is one of the highlights of his life, because instead of just being sad in a dark castle, he is now celebrated once more as the hero of the American Revolution. And his fame is literally skyrocketing at this time. There's also the moment, if you look at history books, that his name is coming in more and more and more. So this is really the moment he becomes the famous man that he is today. He travels through a lot of different places, and he's acclaimed everywhere. Welcome Lafayette in all these different cities in America. And he visits about 2 every day in that period between July and August 1824-25. So you can see all these parades and dinners and galas and all these different celebrations organized for him at this time. Collector's items are made, such as this glove and the plate. And there's a few of these items in the exhibition, I believe. And so anyway, this is a big moment for him, because instead of just being a forgotten man, he's now becoming that hero that he had aspired to be. And one of the sadder moments for him, of course, is when he visits Washington, his adoptive father's tomb here at Mount Vernon in October 1824. He visits the grave, and it's the first time he sees the grave of the man that he had worked together with, that he had admired so much, and that he had, of course, fought the entire revolution with. And so this is also the moment that he visits the room where the key that he had sent is hanging. So for him, this is, of course, a very moving moment, but it's also a moment to remember that he had done, and the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and the role he had played there. And so I will stop here, but I want to also tell you that, of course, after this, he played another role in the 1830s, but he died. I'll just skip this because it's just getting too much. But 1834 is when he died, after having played another role during another revolution in France called the July Monarchy. And he was inspiring other revolutions too, such as here he was writing to Bolivar at the end of his life about, of course, the Latin American revolutions. So Lafayette was not only influential in America and France, but also by writing to the other leaders, he was really one of the main figures in a large network of the revolution, so the revolutionary age that would start after this. So he died, of course, in 1834, and then he was here in Picpus Cemetery, which is in Paris, but he was buried in the ground that he had taken from his farewell tour to France, because he said he wanted to be buried in American ground. So you can see that how that looks here. But from then onwards, many, many, many statues have been built. Many of these towns and cities, as I said before, have been named after him. And he really became the symbol. Here's a special Lafayette escadrille. But anyway, so what happened with, of course, the First and the Second World War in Europe, when the Americans came to help France, it was mainly Lafayette, we are here, the famous sentence. Lafayette was considered like, Lafayette did that for us, we're going to do that for you now. So he was referred to many times in many different moments between the French and American relations from then onwards up until today. And even today, for instance, when you saw the D-Day commemorations that happened, I think in July or June of year, Macron and Biden would come together, and they mentioned Lafayette both a few times in their speeches, just to show how relevant this figure is still, and the symbol, because he represents himself as, of course, one of the main heroes, but he mainly represents all these Frenchmen and American men that worked together, that found ways to overcome all their differences and to build these bridges that are so essential in the world, but also for alliances, of course, today. So the French-American relations continue on the same note right now. And of course, Lafayette should be remembered for all that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeRode. We are going to have a quick Q&A session. I wish we could get to everybody, but if you do want the microphone, please raise your hand. My colleague Bridget in the back will come on that side. I'll come on this side, and we'll alternate back and forth, but just please wait for the microphone so everybody online can hear it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think I saw your Chastellux lecture, which I really enjoyed too.
Thank
But
you.
I was wondering what were the foot soldiers doing while Lafayette was in France, and then they were touring the U.S. So were they having skirmishes, or did they go home, or what happened?
So the French soldiers,
no, the Americans.
Yeah, American. Well, at this, what I described was mainly during the winter of 1780 and 81. And so the French soldiers were located in Newport. They were just in their winter camps, as were the Continental Army soldiers as well. So they were just encamped at this moment while the generals and officers were doing this tour and trying to get to know each other. The two armies were separated very clearly. They were not supposed to work together. They were not supposed to even talk together, because there was sort of orders of Washington and the French king himself that said, if we start to mingle the soldiers, that's going to go absolutely wrong because of all these differences, and they're going to fight, because that had happened before. So they were very separate. So they just had to wait in their encampments, which is not easy for soldiers at the time because there was nothing to do. And boredom was one of the most problematic things, because they started to fight. There were problems within the discipline of the army. But most of these American soldiers, they would just stay in their encampments, or if their period of enlistment was over, they would just go home. So it depends. But for the French, they did not have an option to go home. They would just stay in the encampment, and they were there for 11 months at the end. So that was very long. And again, there's not much to do. So they would have some mock battles together, for instance, they would train. They would just collect food and things like that, but there was not that much. So the lack of action for them was really hard. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. But after his wound at Brandywine, it's reported that Washington took him to his own surgeon and said, treat him as my son.
Yeah.
Do you think he said that?
No. The only place you can read that is Lafayette's own memoirs. So that's always, a problem. I would say it could be so, but it's a little early in their relationship, if you think about it, to be immediately let's consider him a son, because they didn't know each other that well yet. He could have said it just as something, but I would say that the deeper bond that would really grow between the two men took more time than that. So I don't believe it necessarily, but at the same time, as we know, Lafayette was very good at sort of his PR campaign. So in order to say that, he wrote it down. I remember there's another testimony from de Kalb, who is of course with Lafayette at that time, another Frenchman, and he writes something different. He just writes that it was just treated, but not necessarily that whole story. So it's, who knows really, but I would say that relationship was true at it evolved, and they became very close, of course. But I would maybe think they spend much more time together in Valley Forge, for instance, and other moments. So I would say probably it evolved slower. But who knows, when you write something later, you might be convinced of that. But again, we always have to take that source with a sort of a grain of salt because of his own ways of glorifying himself. So
Oh, hi, hi. I was a little confused. When Lafayette got in trouble with the revolutionary government, he was imprisoned in Austria. I didn't think the Austrians were in love with the revolutionary government at that
Yeah.
point.
yeah, no, that is indeed confusing. But the reason is that before he got arrested in France, so if he would have been arrested in France, he would have ended up immediately under the guillotine, very likely. But he fled. He went to the Austrian Netherlands. So he spent some time in the place I'm born, Utrecht, but okay. But then he was arrested there by, I think actually the Austrians, because they were sort of an ally to the French monarchy. And so they made the decision not to bring him back to France, but to imprison him in Austria, just in order to not have him back in France because he would get killed, but also he could just not go back and no one knew what to do. So they're like, okay, let's imprison him in Austria. Yeah.
Wonderful synthesis with a lot of good facts. Two short questions. What was Lafayette's relationship with Nathaniel Greene in the Southern campaign? That was quite a responsibility to bottle up Cornwallis. I thought that was Greene, but I guess not. And secondly, speaking of Rochambeau, how did that convoy get through the British Navy? I would think they'd have a lot of agents that would have been following that because to bring 6,000 soldiers, I imagine it was a full convoy. Thank you.
So the first question about Nathaniel Greene and Lafayette. So true, I've said very briefly, like Lafayette did the whole South. There were a lot of other Continental Army officers and generals involved in keeping Cornwallis there. It's mainly that particularly during Yorktown, it was Lafayette was very influential in keeping Cornwallis in particularly Yorktown, where he was positioned at the time. But before that, for like 6 months, about 6 months, they are just around in different locations in the South. And there's Greene, there's other people such as like Marion and others that are just chasing the different British units. So Lafayette is one of them. Lafayette is quite successful in chasing him, and they're like going through literally the swamps and fighting. It's kind of a guerrilla warfare that they're part of, and Greene is absolutely influential there as well. But it's true that it's a cooperation of several officers that are just chasing the British, but it's never like it's complicated for the British. It creates problems for their organization, but it's not a battle that they win. So it's just sort of a chasing situation in the South. And the other question about the Navy, so that is the French, how did they come through? Like when they come to Newport in July of 1780, how do they do that? That is indeed quite surprising that the British are not immediate. They could have attacked in the middle of the sea already, like on the ocean while traveling. They did take a big detour to not have where the British fleet was to start with. But then when they arrived, the French first wanted to go to the Chesapeake Bay to put their navy there and the soldiers. But when they arrived they could see in the distance, they could see a lot of British ships already lined up. So they decided that it would be too dangerous. So that's why they go to Newport. So they didn't plan to go to Newport as a first step, but there was too much of a British threat. So as you say, there was that British threat. And then they made it soon enough to Newport. But as soon as they arrived, they started to see the British ships also coming. And that's why they need a very strong fortified encampment, which they made. And then it's mainly British decisions that they decided in a sort of clumsy way with the different officers that make decisions that are not lining up. And at the end, they don't attack them. But they're threatening it all the time. Like there's in August and September, there is almost every day there's threats of British attacks that don't materialize. And then same goes for the whole Yorktown campaign. It's similar as the French and Americans have planned everything very precisely and it works. But the British, they don't get along in their officer corps and it fails. So this is a simple explanation. There's many more factors, but that's really quite what it was.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeRode. I was just wondering, I know you mentioned a big motivator for Lafayette was him losing his father so young in the 7 Years' War. I was wondering, was there any evidence of issues or discussion between Lafayette and Washington or other American officers who maybe served or commanded troops for the British during the 7 Years' War?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the the Americans that were already part during the 7 Years' War and how they felt sort of it. And particularly Washington himself was obviously very frustrated in his own career in the British Army. He had hoped to make promotions that he did not make. The 7 Years' War was absolutely awful for him. He lost everything actually. All the battles he was part of were lost. And he just was very frustrated by the functioning mainly of the British system. And that is very similar to Lafayette, but also people such as Chastellux and Rochambeau, because they had faced the exact same mechanisms during the 7 Years' War. Because in France, it was the same in order to advance, it became something that you needed, especially money and good connections at court, and not necessarily talent. And people like Chastellux are complaining about that during the 7 Years' War in the exact same way as Washington is complaining about his lack of possibilities because he is not a British aristocrat. And so they feel the same frustrations, even if the French are aristocrats, but it's a different thing. But they really have the same type of frustrations with their hopes of advancement, they hope of glory in the army and so on. And then, of course, there is a common hatred towards the British, or hatred is mainly a big word, but more like they want to win finally from them in another way. So the French want to win, but Washington has sort of a personal problem, obviously, with the British. So there is that common hatred. There's a common ground in the 7 Years' War, I would say, right there. And one of the more sort of fun facts or whatever coincidences of history is that when Lafayette arrives at Yorktown, oh no, that's not Yorktown yet, but anyway, there's another battle, and then the same man that killed his father is killed in a bomb, and he with a sort of big cannon, and then he sees Mr. Phillips die, and then afterwards he's fighting Cornwallis, who was also present at Minden, so it's all connected. Chastellux was at Minden, Rochambeau was at Minden, they were all there, so these are the connections.
Did Lafayette know l'enfant? And have you read of any interaction between them?
So I'm not totally sure how well they knew each other, but they have for sure met because L'Enfant came to Paris to design that eagle, and Lafayette was the one that distributed the eagle. And so there's this moment. They must have probably met during the American Revolution. It's something I should look into much more to give you a definite answer on when they met and how far, like how much, and maybe someone knows here. But I would be very surprised if they would not know each other, but they were for sure part of the same circles, as in during the Continental, like during the American Revolution, but also particularly after. And probably when he came back here, he would have met. So yes, I would, yeah.
Thank you for a very fascinating discussion. Can you please tell us how you came to have access to the private papers of Chastellux?
Yes. So it was a long time ago, but about 30 years ago, my parents bought a home in France, in Burgundy. And so it's a long story, but I'll tell it a little shorter. But so we have a big tree called the tulip poplar tree. And the local legend said it was planted by Lafayette himself. And then further research showed it was not Lafayette, but Chastellux, that uncle that had brought the tree back from the American Revolution. And it ended up in our garden because of family relations between the two families there. So that's how my curiosity started. But then I went to the Chateau de Chastellux because I had seen the name Chastellux and the connection to that tree. And so when I met the owner of the castle that lives there today, whose name is Philippe de Chastellux, he's a descendant of a 1,000-year-old family that lives in the same castle for all these generations. And so when I told him about the tree, he said, that's so fun because I have the exact same tree. So that's how the circle was there. But then I said, okay, so who is François-Jean Chastellux and why do we not know him? And then he said, well, I don't really know either, but the fact is we have an archive tower. And it took a few years to get there at the end, but they have a tower full of archives. It starts in 1328 up until today. So about 700 years of family archive. And one of the parts is François-Jean de Chastellux's archives in about 10 big boxes in a row. And in there were all these letters of George Washington, of Thomas Jefferson, of Franklin, of Lafayette, and they had been closed since his death. So it was one of these amazing finds that led me to continue the research on him for many years, writing about, well, his full biography that I had written, but also, of course, his like there's a lot to do more with it. So now I'm working still on the archive, working on the English book on Chastellux and his friends and what they've done for the American Revolution. But yeah, that was the short story of how that all works out.
So you mentioned Silas Deane.
Yeah.
Do you think Lafayette sought out Silas Deane or Silas Deane sought out Lafayette?
I believe it was Lafayette himself that knew that Silas Deane was in town recruiting French officers, young men that would be excited to join the Continental Army. And so he asked someone that I don't remember who it was, but someone that knew him, and then they got introduced. But it was really Lafayette that pushed for that meeting to happen.
We do have a few Zoom questions, if you wouldn't mind. The first one, and this is popping up a couple times. You mentioned, excuse me, towards the beginning when Lafayette first comes over here, you mentioned that it's the myth surrounding him defying the king, him defying his father-in-law, but they had an idea. Can you go more into that?
Yes. So there is one of the most famous things that have been repeated over and over and over is Lafayette went secretly to the US and he didn't listen to the French king who forbade him to go. And then his whole family was against it. They didn't want him to leave. He then secretly bought a ship with his private money to go. And then everyone was shocked. That's kind of the story that is out there because he wrote that himself in his memoirs again. And so there's one book that has really, like, there's two French historians and it's only in French. So maybe that's why the myth is still so strong, but there's a lot of new and recent research that shows that Lafayette was part of a group. They all helped him. His father-in-law gave most of the money for that particular ship to be bought. So it was not that he was not listening to his family. The family helped him, even if it was probably a little complicated because his wife was pregnant and the father of that wife was helping him. But still, that's just the way people apparently were, like, I think were quite inspired to help Lafayette to have an important military career, which was also good for his father-in-law. So there's the story of that ship, but also the king had to, he knew that if it would be public and open, that the war with Great Britain could escalate between France and Great Britain, because of course, as we know, there was this whole covered aid period. And within that period, the French decided not to openly help the Americans. Of course, the British, by the way, obviously knew, but they didn't want to openly do it because that would be considered a declaration of war. And so someone like Lafayette, who is very important at court, leaving to the Continental Army would be considered could be a provocation that could have led to that war. And Louis XVI could not afford that war yet because he was in the middle of reforming and improving his army to fight. So to say to Lafayette, yeah, just go openly was not possible. And so he was aware of it. He did not stop him, but he also didn't openly say, yes, go. So there's a subtle difference between forbidding someone to go and kind of saying, go, but do it fast, please. So there's that part. And that has been not researched by myself, but there's some recent books, if ever someone wants to know. I have put them in the slides, but they do mention the myth and then the reality, because one of the things that most people have always done is use his memoirs, Lafayette's own words, without necessarily going around. And one of the main reasons is because American historians don't necessarily have access to a lot of other material, and it's mainly all in French. So there is that reason.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to combine two questions here. A lot of interest on your biography on Chastellux, and then your fourth book. Can you, one, tell our viewers if they can purchase a copy of your biography on Chastellux in English? And no, unfortunately, okay, then we'll go to the next one. Can you give us some more insight on your forthcoming book, please, and when we can expect that?
Yeah, so the biography on François-Jean Chastellux came out in 2022 in France, in French language. And so it's not translated yet. I would love to do it. So let's find out ways to make that happen, to have the English biography. I would say in a shorter version, because my book now is about 800 pages, which is sort of okay in France, but here probably a little too long. But I am working on ways of thinking that, and I'm just starting a postdoctoral fellowship in which probably that will actually happen. So it's going to come at one point. But right now I'm working on an English book that includes Chastellux' story, that also includes Lafayette's story, but also Rochambeau and another major general. So when I was working on Chastellux' biography, I wanted to understand how he worked with the people around him, leading to another archival discovery similar to the one with Chastellux, of the other major general. So he was major general, and there was another called Vioménil, and Vioménil's papers were thought lost, but I found them in Burgundy again, in another archive. That was not a private archive, but it was an archive of the heavy metal industry of a place called Le Creusot. And so there's like about 3,000 pages, particularly on the American campaign, from that man, the Major General, the Baron de Vioménil. So I included that in my new book, of course. So it becomes a story of 4 men, and through their eyes, we're following the French campaign. So I'm in the end stages of that. So I don't know when it's coming out, but in not too long. So.
Very good. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you very much. And I just want to let everybody know, I think we just witnessed a world record tonight. She just went through 152 slides in 1 hour. I nearly had a heart attack when she sent me that yesterday. But thank you, Dr. DeRode, for being here. Thank you all for coming, both in person and online. And we will see you next time. Have a good holiday weekend.